Hello and welcome to this Arirang News special on Monday, February 26th here in South Korea. I'm Peunji. In just a few moments, we will bring you live coverage of the joint press conference on the summit between President I재명 and his Brazilian counterpart, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. The Brazilian president, who's on a 3-day state visit to South Korea, last visited the country in 2005 during his first term. Presidents Lee and Lula last met on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Canada last June. Now, while we wait for today's summit press conference to begin, here in the studio we have Professor Mason Ritchie, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Welcome to the studio.
Great, thanks for having me.
So this marks the Brazilian president's first state visit to South Korea in 21 years, right? What significance does this carry?
Yeah, so I think it means quite a bit. In the first place, we're talking about a global South country that has risen in prominence and importance, and is now a significant player on the world stage. And that the fact that the leader of that country is coming here to South Korea, which is a middle power, economic and notably technical powerhouse. Shows, I think, how significant globalization, can still be, despite the sort of protectionism that we see happening in the world and the sort of fragmentation in terms of international politics. So I think that's a part of the story. I think another part of the story is that you have two robust democracies who are meeting. Two robust democracies who, of course, do have a history at various points of authoritarianism in their own countries, in some cases quite recently. And so here you have two countries with this democratic profile, which again I think having their leaders get together, especially from two different regions, really I think says something about how democratic backsliding, as we've seen internationally, doesn't have to be the norm, that we can see adjustments. I think the third major significance, of course, is simply the economics of the relationship between South Korea and Brazil. Those economic relations are complementary, notably in terms of natural resources from Brazil, and as I mentioned earlier, the technological dimension, especially real cutting-edge technological dimension in South Korea, and that trade story, as well as the larger relationship economically and in terms of trade between the two countries, perhaps also stands as a counterpoint to some of the increasing trade fragmentation and some of the trade restriction and trade protectionism that we're beginning to see. And then we're looking at an upgrade of the relationship diplomatically to a strategic partnership between these two countries. So it's sort of not just looking to the immediate benefits, but also looking forward to developing that partnership into the future.
Right, like you just mentioned, a lot of things on the agenda, from diplomatic relations to technology and natural resources, and we will be hearing from these two leaders shortly. But what might have been on the agenda as a whole?
Yeah, so I think clearly the most significant thing that's on the agenda is the short and medium term actions that each of these two leaders can instruct their governments and their businesses, or maybe not instruct their businesses, but incentivize their businesses to begin to grow that economic relationship more, and notably, as I mentioned, in terms of natural resources and technology. So it looks like we're looking at, as I said, the upgrading of the current partnership to a strategic partnership, which opens up new lines of effort economically, diplomatically, and in other ways between the two countries. And there's, if I understand correctly, going to be, at least there has been talk of putting together a sort of 3-year action plan to activate those areas. And then sort of beyond that kind of strategic framework, obviously the things that are going to be probably subject to memoranda of understanding and various discussions between business leaders and the government sort of facilitating that are going to be the way that the South Korean tech industry, notably, as well as the consumer market here, can benefit from inputs coming from Brazil, things like manganese, bauxite, niobium, other types of critical minerals, that graphite that can go into the tech industry here. Obviously, Brazil's big agribusiness sector can help support some of the agricultural market here as well. So that's part of the story. And then on the Brazil side, they're going to want, in exchange for that growing relationship, they're going to want to move up the value chain themselves, notably in some of these critical mineral areas. In addition to that, there's cosmetics, pharmaceuticals from the South Korean side. That's important for Brazil. There's some energy cooperation, batteries, AI cooperation. That's another thing. So we're seeing AI in everything. So I'm sure it will make it onto the agenda here in one form or another. So that's going to be there. And then I think another area that we might see something on is sort of multilateral cooperation. Notably, these two middle powers, working together, I think, to try to push some reforms on the multilateral system, which has, of course, been suffering for a lot of different reasons, whether that be Russia or whether that be the U.S.-China rivalry, which has hurt the functioning of the multilateral system. Both South Korea and Brazil have an interest in upholding that as middle powers that don't want to be, as we say, sort of forced into choosing between major powers.
Right, and Brazil is South Korea's largest trade and investment partner in Latin America. So how important is Brazil exactly to South Korea?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously really important. One of the major things, of course, that we're seeing in this world of increased trade protectionism, as I mentioned, is that middle powers are trying to find ways to get around the trade difficulties that they face, whether that be China's predatory trade practices abroad, or the way that it uses its internal market in a way that's abusive for companies that are located there, or whether that be the United States under Trump with his various now illegal, although possibly replaced with new illegal tariffs, and the uncertainty that that's generated. We're seeing middle powers. We've seen this from Canada. We've seen this from Europe. We've seen this, from now, other middle powers in the BRICS grouping, of which Brazil is obviously one, try to build out their relationships with other partners. And in the case of South Korea, Brazil, along with, let's say, Southeast Asia and the Middle East, are some places to begin to diversify some of your value chains, some of your export markets, some of the important inputs that come into your economy. Canada is another one, beyond the, let's say, sort of usual suspects, as these sort of diversification routes, such as, for instance, Europe or Japan. So, South Korea has to diversify away, unfortunately, in some respects, from the United States and from China because of the behavior of these two countries over the last 215 years. And so Brazil is an important part of that. I think another way in which we see an important part of the relationship, as I mentioned or hinted at earlier, is diplomatically. We're going to want to see, I think, more middle powers trying to work outside of the constraints of some of their traditional relationships and try to diversify some of their diplomatic partners, notably in terms of some reforms of many elements of the multilateral system, whether that be at the United Nations or the World Trade Organizations or other areas as well. And Brazil is an important part of that equation as a member of the G20. And in fact, I believe the last time Lula was here was for the G20 in 2010. And obviously they're an important partner with BRICS, which means that they're an important facilitator for the way that a country like South Korea can deal with China or Russia or India, and sort of a reform of some of the multilateral system. And the multilateral bodies is probably in some form or the other desirable and in the equation as well.
So would the number one diplomatic goal that President Lee Jae-myung would want to achieve from Lula's visit would be middle powers working together, is that correct?
I think that's an important part of it, yeah. I think it's important for Lee Jae-myung to show not only South Koreans and show other middle powers, but also to show the United States and China that they're not as caught between those two as perhaps one might see, and that there are other options out there. Obviously, no country can replace for South Korea the United States, and no country can replace for South Korea China. They're both critical parts of the way that South Korea secures both its security as well as its economics. But you need to have a diversity of partners, whether it be economically or diplomatically, and certainly that's a message that's not only important for Lee and for the South Korean people, but also for the U.S. and China themselves to hear South Korea say that it can have some autonomy.
Right, and before coming here, President Lula was in India, and he said he doesn't want a new Cold War. And this is kind of viewed as a message toward the Trump administration to sort of treat all countries equally. What's your take on this?
It's possible that that's a message, perhaps primarily directed towards the United States. In recent months, over the last year, basically since Trump has come back into office, we have seen U.S.-Brazil relations worsen, and a significant reason for that is because of the tariffs that Trump has put on Brazil, which he's done for all countries, but Brazil has been subject to fairly harsh negotiations rhetorically, led by Trump and his team, and also quite a bit of volatility in that, where tariffs have gone on and then gone off again. So there's been quite a bit of volatility there, and then also, and perhaps to some degree even more problematically from a certain perspective, Trump has been notably personally involved in meddling in Brazilian domestic politics by supporting former President Bolsonaro, in a rhetorical action that crosses all diplomatic red lines, which of course Trump doesn't care about. But that's obviously deeply problematic for Brazil as a state, but also for Lula in particular. Right now the relations between the U.S. and Brazil are fairly tense in some respects, and so you can imagine that might be the case. I think it's been baked into the cake in Brazil's diplomatic outlook for decades that China is a problematic partner, but we haven't seen the U.S. be such a problematic partner really until Trump's come back in this last time, and all of that's sort of come to a head not only with the tariffs and the support for Bolsonaro, but then most recently this sort of idea of Trump that he's reenacting or reinvigorating a new version of the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States asserts a sort of quasi-colonial ability to control every country in the Western Hemisphere, and for a large population, middle power and an emerging economy like Brazil, that's simply an unacceptable rhetorical language. So perhaps Lula is using the comments about the new Cold War as a way of sort of pushing back against that as well.
And Lula actually said he could be meeting Trump in the first week of March. So I guess those issues could be on the agenda when they meet in March, right?
Of course. I think Lula's probably seen enough of the way that Trump interacts with leaders in Trump 2.0 to have an idea perhaps of how he can craft a strategy. And you don't want to perhaps go in and be too aggressive and get Zelensky'd, as we saw happen last year when Zelensky was famously ambushed in the White House. So you don't want to tank relations with the United States either. But at the same time, flattery works on Trump, but he also respects strength. And I think that making a type of comment that sort of puts the United States on notice that Brazil isn't going to simply take whatever type of rhetorical language and diplomatic and economic activity the United States puts forth, but will assert itself, as long as that's done in a way that is judicious. I think that that's actually sending a message to the United States in advance of this type of meeting that Trump can't simply or shouldn't simply think that he can walk all over Lula.
So where exactly does Brazil stand in the rivalry between the United States and China?
So, Brazil, which is, as I mentioned earlier, a BRICS country, like every country, I think, that deals with China, knows that you have to be wary of China, right? They're not naive, right? They understand that China has a very highly self-interested and in some cases highly predatory economic model that involves all different types of ways of using economic leverage in ways that could hurt Brazil. But they are nonetheless a very important partner. 28% of Brazil's exports, notably in agribusiness, go to China. That's a huge part of their export model. So they are wary of China, but they are also, of course, in some sense, I won't say necessarily dependent, but they rely on China as an important partner. So they are wary, but a partner. I think what's new about the Brazil relationship in between the U.S. and China is how, as I mentioned earlier, Brazil has had to be, I don't know if shocked is the right word, but has to be very disconcerted by the way that the United States has become a much more predatory country, whether that be, as I mentioned earlier, through the revival of the Monroe Doctrine and the sort of assertion of a quasi-colonial right to control other states in its hemisphere, which we saw most recently with the Maduro exfiltration and all of the boat strikes that we've seen take place in the Caribbean and the waters north of South America, or whether that be the tariffs that have been placed, or whether that be on Brazil and other countries, or whether that be the meddling in domestic politics of Brazil, as I mentioned earlier, that Trump notably has done in terms of Bolsonaro. That's made, I think, Brazil very uneasy. And, as I said earlier, if you're Brazil, you can't escape the United States, which is a reasonably close neighbor. You can't escape China, which is an important export partner. And of course, the United States is also an important business partner. And so therefore, as a responsible middle power, you need to start diversifying your partners and find alternatives to some of the supply chains that you build, some of the diplomatic friends that you have in order to make those lines of effort more favorable for you.
Right, so that goes for all middle powers, including South Korea.
Each one is a little bit different because they all have different equities, they all have different dependencies, they all have different sources of strength and potential vulnerabilities. But yeah, in general, and we're seeing more and more, I think middle powers try to find ways to go around or at least to mitigate some of the risks from this much more rough and tumble world of great power politics that we're experiencing today.
Right. So we're still waiting for this joint press conference to begin. And while we wait for that, over in the United States, the White House was moving swiftly to restore tariff pressure after a Supreme Court ruling last week dealt a blow to President Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs. Our Oh Soo-young reports.
The United States says its trading partners want to keep existing trade agreements in place, even after the Supreme Court struck down President Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNN on Sunday that Washington's counterparts want to maintain previously concluded trade deals. He stressed that the court ruling only blocked tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, adding that the president still has other authorities. Trump has already moved to use them. On Friday, he triggered a never-before-used Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, imposing a 10% global tariff. One day later, he said the rate would rise to 15%, the maximum allowed under the law. He also said new legally permissible tariffs would be announced within months. Section 122 allows tariffs of up to 15% for 150 days to address balance of payment concerns. Any extension requires congressional approval. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, meanwhile, allows tariffs on national security grounds and has previously been used on steel and automobiles. The administration is also eyeing Section 301 of the Trade Act, which introduces tariffs after investigations into unfair or discriminatory trade practices. In Seoul, the ruling Democratic Party, the government, and the Office of the President held a closed-door meeting. According to Democratic Party floor spokesperson Moon Kum-ju, participants agreed that the swift passage of the Special Act on Investment in the United States is in the national interest. They pledged to process the bill by March 9th, as agreed by both ruling and opposition parties. Officials also shared concerns that Washington could invoke Section 301 and other trade measures and agree to refrain from hasty countermeasures.
I would say governments around the region will try to stay competitive in the U.S. market, avoid becoming the targets of the latest rounds of tariff, and position themselves as alternative manufacturing bases when supply chains shift. So you might see some quiet adjustments, incentives to attract relocated factories, closer monitoring of transshipment, and also more trade diplomacy, but not open bargaining power plays, because that is frankly not how Asian countries work, right?
Meanwhile, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer signaled that enforcement will intensify. He told media that investigations have been launched into Brazil and China under Section 301. He added that Washington will probe excess production capacity in several Asian countries, saying some produce more than they consume and distort global markets. Greer also said that the Supreme Court ruling would not affect the upcoming US-China summit, scheduled for late March or early April. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
And over in Italy, the 2026 Milano Cortina Winter Olympics have come to an end, with South Korea finishing 13th overall and meeting its 3 gold medal target powered by short track success. Short track gold medalist Kim Gil-lee was named the Korean team's MVP. Our Lee-seung-jae reports.
South Korea has achieved its goal at the Milan Cortina Winter Olympics, securing 3 gold medals thanks to a strong lead push from its short track speed skating team. The country also finished the games with 4 silvers and 3 bronzes. That meets the target set by the Korean Sport and Olympic Committee, which had aimed to win at least 1 more gold than at the 2022 Beijing Winter Games, where South Korea collected 2 golds, 5 silvers, and 2 bronzes. The decisive 3rd gold came Friday night when short track skater Kim Gil-lee captured the women's 1,500-meter title, edging out teammate Choi Min-jung. Earlier that day, the men's 5,000-meter relay team added a silver medal to the tally. Once again, short track skaters carried the medal campaign. They accounted for 2 golds, 3 silvers, and 2 bronzes, proof of the sport being South Korea's most reliable Winter Olympic discipline. Kim Gil-lee stood out as the only South Korean athlete to win multiple gold medals in Milan Cortina. On Sunday, she was named the most valuable player of the South Korean delegation.
There were many truly difficult moments, but thanks to everyone who supported me, I was able to endure them, and I will continue to grow into an even better athlete in the future.
The Korean Sport and Olympic Committee said she was voted MVP by South Korean journalists covering the Games. The committee has presented the award to top-performing athletes at major multi-sport events since the 2023 Hangzhou Asian Games. Lee Seung-jae, ArirangNews.
And physical AI has excited people with new cool tech and improvements in working conditions, while some are concerned about their jobs being replaced. So can politicians find the answer to make the most of this technology while protecting its people and their livelihoods? Our Kim Do-yeon spoke to lawmakers addressing this issue.
As the prospect of robots replacing human labor becomes reality with physical AI's recent rapid advancement, the political world has begun debating the subject. President Ije명 referenced the Luddites in 19th century to suggest you can't stand in the way of progress.
그 기계 파괴 운동이라고 사람들이 일자리를 뺀다고 기계 부수자 이런 운동이 있었잖아요. 근데 그 흘러오는 거대한 수레를 피할 수 없습니다. 결국 그 사회에 빨리 적응해야죠. 기술을 익히고 그걸 증기기관 기계를 통제하는, 조정하는 또는 만들어내는, 수리하는 이런 기능이 또 필요하잖아요.
Consulting firm McKinsey forecasts that by 2030, 800 million jobs will be gone due to AI, and South Korea is at the heart of it, with the highest robot density in the world last year. And for a lawmaker who represents Ulsan, often known as the industrial capital of South Korea, where heavy industries and auto plants make up the city's economy, the reality is coming fast.
If we simply resist this change, the outcome is clear. Companies will move overseas, jobs will vanish, and the very foundation of Korean manufacturing will collapse, dragging the entire economy down with it.
Meanwhile, lawmaker Choi Eun-seok has proposed a soft landing bill to complement South Korea's existing AI Basic Act.
We must prioritize education and retraining. By helping our workers adapt to new, complex roles in this evolving landscape, we can ensure no one is left behind in the transition.
While at early stages of talks, lawmakers are also looking at ways to make sure everybody directly benefits from physical AI and ease the concerns over job losses.
Instead of corporate ownership, imagine a citizen-funded model where profits from robot labor are redistributed back to the people. In the long run, implementing a robot tax or automation tax will be an inevitable necessity.
Most importantly, both lawmakers call for a unified national dialogue. They see this not just as a challenge, but as an opportunity for South Korea to lead the world in balancing innovation with labor.
As the AI era arrives, we must proactively address how it will reshape our labor and daily lives. Now is the time to pool our wisdom to ensure that human value isn't lost in the age of machines.
Now, with the transition to AI seemingly inevitable, the world is watching to see if business, labor, and both sides of the aisle can come together to set a new global standard for the future. Kim Do-yeon, 아리랑뉴스.
A new girl duo blending traditional Korean elements with modern music made its debut just a month ago, bringing a fresh new sound to K-pop. Our culture correspondent Park Gon-woo has the story.
Surpassing 10 million views for their debut music video within a month, the fresh new duo 도들이 is drawing global attention for incorporating traditional Korean elements into their music while weaving traditional dance into their performances to create a lyrical and dreamlike atmosphere.
At first, it might feel unfamiliar or even difficult, but the charm, emotion, and energy of traditional Korean music can go beyond language. By blending it with more familiar genres, we wanted to make it easier for listeners to approach.
The name 도들이 reflects that mission, as it's a combination of the traditional rhythmic pattern 도두리 장단 and the word free, reflecting their ambition to transcend genre boundaries through a traditional sound. Youngju has trained in traditional Korean narrative singing pansori since the age of 3, coming from a third-generation family of traditional musicians, making the transition to dance an even greater challenge for her.
아리랑 스리랑 아라리가 났네 아리랑 아라리가 났네.
Wow.
I've been singing my whole life, so dancing while singing was my biggest challenge. But practice is the only answer. I want to become a role model who makes others feel that challenges don't have to be feared.
And Songhyun, who majored in traditional Korean dance, hopes to incorporate even more traditional styles into their performances.
Since this kind of music has no fixed answer, finding the right direction is our biggest task. I hope to become an artist who brings both charisma and joy on stage, one day incorporating traditional dance elements, such as drum performances, like Tangu dance.
And it seems to be resonating globally as the duo says more global fans are engaging with them online, with some even calling them the real-life version of Huntrix.
Some said they burst into tears watching our performance. That made me feel that emotion can be truly delivered despite language differences. Like in K-pop Demon Hunters, just as K-culture blends naturally into the story, we hope to let the beauty of traditional Korean music blend naturally into K-pop.
Looking ahead, they say they hope to collaborate widely, even naming BTS, while expressing interest in exploring R&B and jazz. Despite their bold artistic direction, their goals remain grounded.
My goal is to always do my best with consistency, values that are emphasized strongly by JYP.
My biggest goal is to not lose myself as I continue this journey.
With humility guiding their journey, 도들이 is just beginning, bringing tradition into the future of K-pop while expanding the boundaries of the K-pop scene. Park Gon-woo, 아리랑뉴스.
And in just a few moments, we will bring you live coverage of the joint press conference between President I재명 and the Brazilian president. And while we are still waiting for that joint press conference to begin, so Professor Ritchie, this is the Brazilian president's first state visit to Korea in 21 years since he last visited here in 2005. How significant is this?
Yeah, I definitely think it's important, and I think it really marks now 15 years sort of milestone where Brazil has become so much more of an important country, and it's obvious. Insofar as we see it as an important part of BRICS, as a pillar of the G20, these sort of multilateral bodies, and now we see how it's so important for Korea that you're even going to have a state visit bilaterally. I think one of the things that this fits into, this visit, is the sort of larger narrative that we see of narrative powers, this larger narrative of emerging powers such as Brazil and let's say now second generation already emerged middle powers that have now become quite wealthy, like South Korea. beginning to try to cooperate with each other, or seeing the cooperation they already have maturing, because there are synergies between them. Both countries are democracies, so they can help sort of mutually reinforce the importance of democracy in international affairs. There's a synergy there. Obviously, what we probably see most frequently is the economic synergy, where a country like Brazil has natural resources that are important inputs into a high-tech economy like South Korea. And for me, it's going to be a sort of interesting test case. I'll be curious to see, how this type of middle power cooperation, trying to sort of get around some of the difficulties that are presented by the predatory major powers right now, how that can be stitched together. South Korea, Brazil, but also South Korea, Australia, or South Korea, Indonesia, or South Korea, South Africa, or South Korea, Turkey, and the other way around. Brazil with Australia, or Brazil with countries in Europe, or Brazil with countries in Africa. How it is that we can begin to see middle and emerging powers begin to stitch together, maybe not an alternative order, which since we've seen the international order come so much under stress and in some cases begin to fall apart, but how they can create something that can make up for what has been lost in terms of the multilateral system and the larger international order, which has come under so much stress, whether that be due to the Russia war in Ukraine and the fissures that has caused, or U.S.-China rivalry, or just any of those countries, Russia, China, and the U.S., sort of bilaterally freelancing and causing problems, with their own allies and partners. So I think that one of the things that's significant about this is one more stone in the pathway of trying to see middle powers begin to craft their own future and be subjects of history rather than just objects, the ball to be kicked around by major powers.
Right, and what's also significant is that this is the first state visit by a foreign leader since President Ijeong returned to the Blue House, right?
Yeah, and of course that's always a big deal, and there's just a lot more pomp and circumstance and more things to make sure that you get exactly 100% right when it is a state visit versus official visits or working level visits. And of course, this is an important bilateral partner, and arguably, or I think in some sense inarguably, the most important diplomatic event that Lee Jae-myung has gone through since he's come into office, are the bilateral and multilateral meetings that took place in the context of APEC. And of course, that was a huge challenge because you were trying to set up bilats with the United States and with China and with Japan and with other countries at a time of great international fluctuation. They were trying to get everything done beforehand, obviously with the response to U.S. tariffs and strategic modernization of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And then on top of that, trying to actually do the multilateral part of the APEC and try to get not only the protocol done on that correctly and the organization done on that correctly, but obviously also the output that was supposed to come out of it. That's a huge challenge. And I still think for the moment that's probably the most difficult thing they've dealt with. But setting up this type of state visit, it's not easy either. And certainly that's going to have occupied the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Blue House intensely over the last weeks and months. So it's important, and I guess one other positive thing that comes out of it is you do your first one, and then it makes it easier to do subsequent ones as well.
Right, and we've been talking about middle powers working together. So do you think President Lee could use this opportunity as a way for South Korea to sort of navigate relations between the United States and China?
Well, I mean, certainly that's what he and a lot of other middle powers are trying to do. Obviously, countries like Japan and South Korea, which are middle power, and Australia is another one of those, middle powers who are wealthy, highly technologically developed, democratically consolidated, diplomatically practiced and diplomatically resourceful. The fact that all three of those are, in some sense, dependent on the United States for incredibly important aspects of their security, and perhaps no country is more emblematic of that than South Korea, means that you do have, to some degree, simply a little bit less leverage to use these types of relationships with other middle powers as ways of getting out from under the thumb at times of the United States. But as the United States is becoming more unreliable, whether that be because of Trump or whether that be because of other domestic factors in the United States, or whether that simply be because of the international balance of power, which perhaps doesn't look like it's necessarily favoring the United States in terms of its evolution, South Korea has to be creative in the way that it finds certain alternatives to ensuring its national interest. And as I said, I think working with a country like Brazil is significant. We're obviously seeing South Korea try to do that in the Middle East through construction projects and energy deals with partners in the Middle East, whether that be Turkey or the UAE or Saudi Arabia, Qatar, et cetera. South America is an important part of this as well. So Brazil plays a role in that. I mentioned earlier another important country, Canada. Australia is another important one, and they're, unlike Brazil, they're already wealthy, fully emerged, fully advanced economies, but they also have a great complementarity with South Korea's supply chains, notably through providing certain types of critical resources, critical minerals, rare earths, and other natural resource inputs into the South Korean economy. And we've seen those deals grow between South Korea and those countries. And the Brazil visit, the Brazil state visit this time is one more version of that. Just this time with an important emerging partner. We may see at some point weapons deals come onto the agenda as something where Brazil may become a future customer of South Korea. I don't have any particular insight into that, but it seems like something that would be the case. We've seen it happen with Australia. We've seen it happen with, or in the process of seeing it happen possibly with Canada in a submarine deal. We've seen it happen as South Korea's diversified through its K armaments into the European market as well. So that's another place where that could happen. So yeah, it's an important part of the story, and it doesn't only have to be sort of traditional economic areas. It could also be things that fit into sort of interesting spaces of international affairs, such as, for instance, pharmaceutical production, which we might normally in some sense think of as an economic good, because of course it is, but it also, as we know from the COVID period, also carries a very important what we call a non-traditional security dimension, where eventually producing vaccines became a really important part of how it is that the world was able to get past the pandemic. That probably wasn't our last pandemic, and it might be interesting to see to what degree some of the biologics in South Korea and some of the pharmaceutical development work that's done here could be paired, for instance, with production facilities in Brazil, which would be good for Brazil in terms of moving up the value chain of the things that it does in terms of production, but also good for South Korea as well. So I'd be interested to see if that type of thing makes it onto the agenda as well.
Right, so not just diplomacy, but a lot of economic cooperation there. So I guess this could be an opportunity for South Korean companies for South Korea to open up markets to Latin America, and a very big opportunity for South Korean businesses, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just tell South Korea, I hope you have to send, as we say in French, you have to send the elevator back the other way. You're not just trying to get in the Brazilian market, right? You also have to allow Brazil to get into your market as well. Frankly speaking, as a consumer of fruits and vegetables here in Korea, I would not be opposed to South Korea opening up its agricultural market a little bit more, whether that be to the U.S. or whether that be to a country like Brazil. Having some cheaper fruits and vegetables wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. So that's a part of the story. But obviously Brazil doesn't want to just remain an agribusiness exporter and a natural resource exporter. It also wants to move up the value chain itself, right? It wants to start, being able to develop and produce and develop some of more high-tech goods itself. And obviously South Korea has to be a little bit careful, like any high-tech country does. It has to be a little bit careful about how it enters into technological deals with with partner countries, so that you don't end up killing the goose that lays the golden egg. But that's really the whole point of this development model. It's based on trade, right? It's supposed to be win-win in both directions, so that both countries can actually build a higher standard of living through moving up the value chain. So Brazil is going to want that. One of the important ways that could happen, and again, something I hope to see, and also frankly something as a university professor here that would be good for me personally, would be if we see greater people-to-people exchange through university programs, for instance. So again, I don't have any special insight into whether or not this is going to be on the agenda this time around. It typically is in this type of strategic partnership development, but having greater people-to-people exchange, notably through university exchanges and learning exchanges between researchers, is a good way for South Korea to bring people here, and to learn from them, and also to send people abroad, whether that be universities or companies, for them to be able to bring what they know to countries like Brazil as well.
Right, absolutely. So going back to diplomatical issues, President Lula was in India before he came here, and he said he doesn't want a new Cold War, and he could be meeting President Trump possibly next week. So do you think this could be viewed as a message toward the Trump administration?
Yeah, I do. It's entirely possible that this would be a message that that Lula would want to send in advance of a potential meeting with the United States. Not only sort of laying out ahead of time what the Brazilian position is on the U.S.-China rivalry in a sort of general set of terms, but also the message might be to the United States, we respect you, we respect your power, we respect your strength, but we also have our interests, and our interests are not in being, quote unquote, forced to choose between the U.S. and China. And I think ultimately this is precipitated in significant part by sort of three major issues that have really emerged since Trump has taken over office the second time. The first of which, of course, is the tariffs, where the United States has, frankly speaking, simply shown itself to be an irresponsible and unreliable economic partner, as well as one that is bullying and one that is not respectful of either the trade deals that the United States itself had previously worked out with its partner countries, including South Korea, by the way, of course, famously. But also, international law, right? The United States is engaged in, trade practices that, simply speaking, violate its World Trade Organization obligations, right? And so, for a country like Brazil or like South Korea that, has historically relied on the WTO as an important part of the sort of trade pillar for being able to have visibility and predictability in the way that the tariff structure internationally would work, and this is a huge problem. So that's obviously unsettled Brazil enormously and caused quite a bit of consternation there. Secondly, Trump has meddled in domestic politics, notably by supporting former President Bolsonaro, going so far as rhetorically to state that part of the reason why he put higher tariffs on Brazil than other countries was because of what he considered to be unfair treatment of former President Bolsonaro, who himself was engaged in all sorts of illegal and unconstitutional activity and was found guilty in a court of law for that, allegedly did that. And then thirdly, the United States under Trump, revitalizing this notion of Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, in a way that, frankly speaking, smacks of a sort of neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, where the United States arrogates to itself the right to control other countries in its hemisphere, ostensibly out of national security reasons. But regardless of whatever those reasons might or might not be, it's simply unacceptable, both as a matter of international sovereignty, as an important core component, perhaps the fundamental element of international law, notably under the United Nations system, but also simply as a sort of general principle of good neighborliness. Right? It's not the 19th or 18th century anymore, where this type of blatant imperialism or blatant colonialism is acceptable. We thought we had gotten past that, and now Trump wants to revitalize that, and has, frankly speaking, carried it out. Whether that be through the strikes on supposed drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean, in the waters north of South America, which again, blatant violation of international law, or whether that be the ham-fisted attempt to try to annex Greenland and the threats that were thinly veiled behind that. If you're a major middle power in the Western Hemisphere and an emerging and important economy and a large country with several hundred million people as a population, you can't simply allow the United States to do that. And so sending messages perhaps in advance of a meeting between Lula and Trump is a way for Brazil to sort of send out a message in advance that it's going to stand up for itself. Lula obviously doesn't want to be Zelensky, right? He doesn't want to get ambushed the way that Ukrainian President Zelensky was in the White House. But still, you have to send the message that you're not going to simply let the White House walk all over you.
I see. So we are still waiting for the joint press briefing between presidents of South Korea and Brazil to begin, and it will begin very shortly. And while we wait for that, so on the screen, we saw President Lee welcoming President Lula to the Blue House, and they last met in Canada last June, and these seemed pretty close. And these, personal rapport, personal relations act as an important factor in diplomacy, right?
Yeah, they do. I could be wrong, but just sorry for the correction. I could be wrong, but I believe that they actually met at the G20 most recently. In South Africa, if I remember correctly. And in any event, this is personal relations are hugely important, and Lee and Lula have both remarked on the fact that when they were youths, they each worked in factories, and Lee Jae-myung here, of course, famously himself was victim of a factory accident when he was a youth working. They've both bonded to some degree in their G7 and G20 meetings over the fact that they do share this history of working in factories as youths, this kind of blue collar, up and coming, struggling, idealistic youth, and of course they have reached the pinnacle of political success in their respective countries, and that builds quite a formidable basis for familiarity between the two, and sort of something to talk about. These multilateral meetings, they have lots of little awkward moments where the leaders, shake hands and grab elbows and touch each other's shoulders and that sort of thing, and have all of this small talk in the hallways or in the meeting facilities, before or after meetings. The little things that happen kind of on the sidelines, outside of, or that aren't fully scripted by the protocol that we usually see in these types of meetings. And sometimes it's a little hard to figure out what to say, right? Sometimes the language barrier makes a difference too. And at least in this case, Lee and Lula and their interpreters, have something to be able to bond over a little bit, talking about their shared history, and that certainly makes it easier to think about how you can put yourself in your interlocutor's shoes, how it is that you can sort of imagine things from his or her perspective, and that greases the wheels of diplomacy.
Right, and is there a way for Brazil to contribute to inter-Korean relations? Do you think North Korea issues could be on the agenda today?
In any meaningful way, I don't really think so. Brazil, does in some sense act as a country that's slightly non-aligned, being a part of BRICS, but also being a part of the G20. Being a country that prides itself on having good relations with lots of different countries, might in some alternative world make Brazil, a potential partner for a country like North Korea. But at the end of the day, Brazil isn't going to have a decisive influence, or even anything near a decisive influence on what happens in Northeast Asia and on the Korean Peninsula in particular. And in addition to that, right now, North Korea isn't interested in that type of relationship anyway, whether that be with Brazil or really any other country. As we're speaking, the Ninth Party Congress is taking place. The Workers' Party of Korea, Ninth Party Congress is taking place in Pyongyang. And from what we've seen so far, it seems like the hostility between North and South Korea, or at least the hostility viewed by North Korea towards South Korea, remains unchanged. The door to negotiations and talks doesn't seem to be opening in any significant way. You can never say never. They'll always leave the door cracked open a little bit. But it doesn't look like they're interested in any type of inter-Korean and peninsular reconciliation. So, even if you can imagine a world where Brazil might have something to contribute to that, right now that door simply isn't there. North Korea seems primarily interested in continuing to build out its relationship with Russia in terms of its international affairs, as well as also with China. Economically, it's trying to get what it can from Russia through its involvement and support for Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war. It's, of course, continuing to remain closely tied to China economically. Domestically, North Korea is trying to build out its nuclear weapons and its nuclear weapons arsenal, as well as its conventional military. And at least on the nuclear dossier, Brazil is an avowed supporter of a nuclear weapons-free world. So they're all by itself. That already presents a difficulty for relations between Brasilia and Pyongyang. And North Korea, in any event, is primarily focused on the modernization of its military, both in the nuclear and in the conventional sphere domestically, as well as, of course, trying to prop up its economy to the best of its ability. And indeed, it has spent some time in this Ninth Party Congress talking about how successful it has been in doing so over the last 5 years, that there's been some progress there. So I really don't see that there's too much of a possibility. In any event, the first door that North Korea is likely to turn to outside of Russia and China in terms of opening back up again diplomatically is going to be to the United States. And even then, it doesn't seem like right now Pyongyang is showing much interest in that as well. Again, the door remains slightly open, but not enough for Kim Jong-un to walk through for sure.
Right, and you also talked about how the relations between the United States and Brazil has notably worsened since the Trump administration. And Brazil is one of those countries, like all other countries, including South Korea. So it seems the press conference is about to begin. We'll be hearing from the presidents, Ije명 and the Brazilian president, very shortly. We see the president walking into the press briefing room right now. We'll come back right afterwards.
지금부터 대한민국 대통령과 브라질 연방공화국 대통령께서 정상회담 결과를
briefing between President Lee and President Lula da Silva.
Entre o excelentíssimo senhor presidente da República da Coreia e o excelentíssimo senhor presidente da República Federativa do Brasil.
First of all, we would like to hear from the President of the Republic of Korea, President Ije명. Honorable President Lula da Silva and the Brazilian delegation, I'd like to extend my sincere welcome to all of them, together with the people of Korea. Today will be remembered in history as a mark that our bilateral relations took a new leap forward. Korea and Brazil, despite the geographical limit of being located on the opposite side of the globe, we have closely cooperated based on a complementary economic structure. Bilateral trade volume had consistently increased to over $10 billion over the past 5 years, and our cooperation has been expanding to promising future-oriented industries such as space, biopharmaceuticals, and culture. Based on such solid foundation of cooperation, President Lula and myself agreed to elevate the bilateral relations to a strategic partnership. The Korea-Brazil 4-year action plan that we have adopted today will be a roadmap that will guide the bilateral relations in the comprehensive areas such as politics, the economy, practical cooperation, and people-to-people exchanges. Let me explain the detailed outcomes of today's summit. First, President Lula and myself agreed that we need to expand the mutually beneficial economic cooperation of our two countries. Brazil is a key member of Mercosur. I explained the need to promptly resume the negotiation to conclude a trade cooperation between Korea and Mercosur, and President Lula strongly agreed that signing a trade agreement is a critical task. We also agreed to seek a breakthrough based on the trust between the leaders. Second, at today's summit, we have signed 10 MOUs and agreements, thereby establishing implementation framework for practical cooperation in various sectors. The MOU on SME cooperation will serve as an important catalyst to expand the bilateral trade and investments that were mostly focused on large corporations to SMEs. Through the MOU on regulatory cooperation in the health sector, K-cosmetics that have been widely welcomed in Brazil recently will be able to reach even more Brazilian citizens. In the agricultural sector, we signed 3 MOUs. Cooperation with Brazil, which is a leading agricultural nation with advanced farming technologies, is a highly important task for Korea's food security. Through these MOUs, we will strengthen cooperation in next-generation agricultural technologies and promote mutually beneficial and sustainable development of our rural economies. In addition, we will broaden the horizon of cooperation in future industries such as space, defense, and aviation. Last December, the attempted launch of Korea's first commercial launch vehicle, Han-bit Nano, at Brazil's Alcantara Space Center became an important asset for bilateral space cooperation. I look forward to its successful launch in the very near future. In Brazilian transport plane production, Korean parts manufacturer is participating, and in such way, supply chain cooperation is already underway in the aviation sector too. Going forward, our cooperation will advance to an even higher level, including the joint development of next-generation civil aircraft. Third, as long-standing partners and as leaders in the Global South, our two countries agreed to engage in close consultations on global affairs and regional issues. Under President Lula's strong leadership, I highly commend Brazil's leadership in advancing global agendas such as climate action and restoration of multilateralism. Both of us share the view that peace on the Korean Peninsula has profound implications not only for the Northeast Asia, but also for global peace. As I often say, a state where no fight is needed, which is peace, may be difficult to achieve, but is the strongest form of security. I explained in full to President Lula our government's firm commitment to resuming inter-Korean dialogue and cooperation and to opening a future of peaceful coexistence and shared growth. I am confident that our two countries will together work to uphold the value of peace not only on the peninsula but throughout the world. Fourth, I expect that this state visit will further deepen trust and friendship between our two peoples. Last year, Brazilian citizens visiting Korea increased by more than 25%, and demand for learning Korean language in Brazil continues to rise, which demonstrates how K-culture is connecting Korea and Brazil across oceans and continents. Brazilian culture has also had a strong influence in Korea. The girl from Ipanema, a bossa nova classic, have inspired many K-pop composers. Both of us agreed to expand Korean language education in Brazil and increase student exchanges between our two countries to further strengthen people-to-people ties. Also, we will promote cooperation in the content area, including joint film and media productions, building on the strong competitiveness of our film industries. Above all, today's summit was particularly meaningful in that we shared a common vision and common tasks aimed at improving the lives of our people. President Lula has demonstrated that poverty reduction and economic development can be achieved simultaneously, presenting a key model of inclusive growth. This aligns closely with our government's core vision of building a sustainable growth model by enhancing economic dynamism on the foundation of a basic society. In this regard, I explained the vision of AI basic society where the benefits of advances in AI are shared by all, and proposed that our two countries jointly explore policies that create synergy between welfare and economic growth. We will seek concrete ways to expand cooperation and exchanges in policy research between the two governments. Once again, I warmly welcome President Lula and Mrs. Lula to Korea and their state visit. I look forward to meeting you again in the near future and continue today's discussions in an even more constructive manner. Thank you. Next, we would like to hear from President Lula da Silva.
Em seguida, fará o seu pronunciamento o excelentíssimo senhor presidente da República Federativa do Brasil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva.
Presidente e de minha presidente da República da Coreia, meu caro ministro das Relações Exteriores,
Dearest President Ijeong,
ministro da Coreia, meu caro embaixador Mauro Vieira, ministro das Relações,
and Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Ambassador Laduvia, the Ambassador to Brazil, and also all the people of two countries. The state visit of mine is in my third, it will be the last one that would close off my 3 terms. For the last few years, we had strengthened the cooperation with Asia, China, India, China, Malaysia, and Vietnam. I have visited these countries, and in October last year, as first time as a Brazilian president, I attended the ASEAN summit meeting. And to complete this journey, technology and innovation and cultural leader, which is the Republic of Korea, I believe that it was the most essential. And this is my third visit to Korea. In 2005, I paid the first official visit and for G20 summit. But after that, there were no Brazilian presidents visit to Korea. This, I believe, reflects the deep ties. I believe this is a vacancy, actually, compared to the deep ties between the two countries. And this visit, we were able to elevate our bilateral ties to strategic partnership, and we had elevated our cooperational framework. And we were able to solidify the closeness and the friendship between the two countries. Brazil has one of the biggest Korean communities of 50,000, and for the last 6 decades, they have shown the diligence and their integrity, and they have been contributing greatly to the economy of Brazil. K-pop, K-drama, K-food, these are welcomed by millions of people in Brazil. At the moment, about 2,000 Brazilian citizens are residing in Korea, and this number is increasing. Although geographically distant, the political history of the two countries are very similar. In the 1980s, after a long period of resistance, we were able to achieve democratization. And today, 4 decades later, we were faced with another coup d'etat. However, with our people, we have shown and we have demonstrated the resilience and the democracy of our countries. We have reassured the people's sovereignty. The extremism and the false news that are spreading, the more it gets worse, we have to stay we have to stay in close cooperation, even in these dire times. And I have invited President Lee to the recent summit, and we are going to strengthen the cooperation towards democracy today. Brazil is one of the protectors of democratization and democracy, and Republic of Korea has been playing the role of constructive advocate of democracy. And both countries, we have accumulated meaningful economic cooperation. Brazil is one of the biggest trade partners in Latin America for Korea. And South Korea is the 4th trade country of Brazil. However, we have a lot of potential to develop. And we are seeing a lot of new opportunities. And in the core supply chain, we believe that there are many potential opportunities that are lying. Also, new technologies and AI, we have ample room for improvement and cooperation. And I would like to ask President Lee that if we can close this Brazilian beef export issue, then this will greatly enhance the cooperation of our trade cooperation. And in the content industry, we also believe that there will be a lot of potential for growth. And for the production and trade MOUs that we have agreed, we believe that this will facilitate even more trade of the two countries, and this will provide more predictability of the both countries' industries. Also, both countries, the shared interest, we have signed an MOU on financial cooperation. In the Mercosur and South Korea's cooperation, we have agreed on how to resume the talks that are stalled in 2021. And entrepreneurship, AI, entrepreneurship and farming and industry of security will be included here. Also, the critical disease research and pandemic and epidemic research, all these will be included. The Minister of Welfare of Brazil will pay a visit to Korea's smart hospitals in order to learn more best cases. In Brazil, we envision more smart hospitals to be opened. And in the AI industry, we believe that this will be a joint core areas of cooperation. And bioeconomies, food security, and agricultural sectors, we are going to expand our cooperation. In science and technology, biotechnology, space, digital, next generation communication, and IoT will be included for further cooperation. President Lee, just 1 week ago, we have commemorated the Lunar New Year holidays in Korea, and in Brazil, the Carnival, it coincided. And we are also standing at the starting point of our cooperation in the future. I believe this state visit that is coinciding in this 60th year, I believe that this shows our prosperous future that's going forward, and I'd like to extend my visit, my invitation to President Lee to Brazil in the near future so that we can return this hospitality. Thank you.
네, 이상으로 공동언론발표를 마치겠습니다.
Live coverage of the joint press conference between President Lee and Lula. So, Professor Ritchie, so we've just heard from the two presidents. They talked about elevating relations from cooperation on trade, space, culture, and like we discussed, agriculture and people-to-people exchanges. So what stood out to you the most?
Yeah, so I as I was watching, like everyone else, when I was sort of making a list of the areas where both presidents talked about the same thing. So strategic partnership, the possible resumption or working towards getting a Korea-Mercosur trade agreement worked out. They both mentioned some of the MOUs that were signed, people-to-people, K-culture, student exchange, the pharmaceutical industry, AI, the future meetings in the future. So they both talked about carrying on leader-level meetings at other moments in the future. In that sense, that was all more or less to be expected. The background for all of that, of course, is the complementarity of their economies with natural resources and the tech sector here in South Korea. And clearly, that will get a huge amount of attention within that relationship going forward. And so in that sense, I think obviously, things went well. The fact that Lula says, I would like to invite you to come to Brazil in the future, again, means that, the meeting was, well worked out in advance, and they had everything ready to go, and, the signing just needed to be done, and that everything was largely on the same page, and that's exactly the way these things are supposed to work. There were, I guess, 3 areas that I saw come up that I thought were a little bit interesting for one reason or another. The first, President Lee talked about small and medium-sized enterprises and making it possible to open up better possibilities for small and medium-sized enterprises to to cooperate with each other. International trade and commerce is harder for SMEs. And Ijeong himself said, traditionally the relationship between Brazil and South Korea in business has been carried through the channels of large corporations dealing with each other, which can overcome the bureaucratic hurdles to international trade. So it'll be interesting to see how that gets implemented going forward. I have the impression that part of that might have been folded into this notion of how South Korean SMEs might be participating in some of the supply chain for Embraer, the Brazilian civilian aircraft manufacturer. So I thought that was something that was interesting. I think that's worth bringing up. Secondly, I was a little surprised that that President Lula brought up the democratization movements of South Korea and Brazil. Not so much looking back to the 1980s when both countries moved into democratization, but sort of between the lines talking about how in Brazil under Bolsonaro and here in South Korea with the martial law insurrection by Yoon Suk-yeol, bringing up that sensitive point I think is a little bit interesting. It's not going to hurt Ijeong's feelings, obviously, since he came out of this on the winning end of the agenda, but that might be looked at as being a little bit provocative vis-a-vis South Korea as a whole, considering that there is a portion of the population here and a portion of the political class here that sees things very differently with respect to what happened on December 3rd. So that was a little bit interesting. And then thirdly, he brought up the Korean agricultural phytosanitary regulations on Brazilian beef imports. So again, it looks like that at least might have been something that Brazil would have liked to have seen happen in terms of South Korea making it easier for Brazil to import beef into South Korea, and for various reasons that's not possible. Again, as a consumer of beef here in Korea, I would be all for that. So I hope that Ijeong listens to that, and I hope that the agricultural lobby here listens to that, and perhaps we can move forward on that in the future as well.
Right, we can definitely see that a lot of issues happen on the agenda at the meeting. So that ends our special live coverage of the joint press conference for President Lee Jae-myung's summit with Brazilian President Lula. Thanks for watching. We'll be back at 5 p.m. Korea time. Stay tuned.